Episode number 69, Religious Liberty and Your Rights as a Christian, with Jeremy Samek. Fellas, Jeremy and I have been friends for several years now, and he's a guy that's definitely out in the trenches doing the work that others only talk or dream about doing. On a daily basis, Jeremy's fighting the legal battles that threaten our religious freedoms in our country. And as a matter of fact, he's even helped me and our Trail Life group in a significant way. And we actually get into that in our discussion, so make sure you check that part out. Now, the truth is, many are misinformed about what religious freedoms we still have in our country. Christians are uninformed, and those in the workplace, in our school systems, and in civil government even, are misinformed about religious liberties, the rights that Christians have, and this different concepts of separation of church and state, and how far people can go with their religious liberties. And what's more is that when our religious liberties are infringed upon, we do have a biblical basis for what we do. Jeremy and I discussed that a little bit. And there are resources out there to help you. Jeremy has many that he's going to share, and I'll link up in the show notes. In fact, many of these services out there offer their services free of charge. Guys, you got to listen in as Jeremy and I talk about religious liberties and your rights as a Christian. What's up, Dad Hackers? My name is Patrick Antonucci, and I am the host and founder of this podcast and community of Dad Hackers. Dad Hackers is a community of Christian fathers who are devoted to encouraging, equipping, and enabling one another to become the men that God has created and called us to be, so that we can raise up the next generation of fully devoted followers of Christ and leave a legacy of multi-generational faithfulness. Now, on this show, we primarily interview Christian men to dive deep into their experiences and insights into what it means to be a Christian man, a Christian husband, a Christian father, and a Christian leader. We ask questions that dig deep into the thinking and rationale and experiences of these men so that we can all learn and grow into the men that God is calling us to be. I'm so thankful that you've joined us today. Make sure you subscribe so that you never miss any of our value-packed episodes. Also, please make sure you leave an honest review if you're listening to this in iTunes or any other platform that takes reviews. Reviews boost the show's ratings, which means that more dads are going to come across our show and benefit from the content that we put out. I also wanted to let you know that we do have a free private Facebook group just for Christian dads. So after the show, make sure you hop on over to the show notes. There's a link for that in there as well. Hey, Jeremy, how you doing today, man?
I'm doing well. How are you, Patrick?
Doing pretty good. Thank you so much for coming on the show. I appreciate it.
Well, thank you for having me.
Yeah, so Jeremy's a pretty good friend of mine. We've known each other for several years now, and we started a Trail Life group at my local church, and Jeremy was very instrumental in getting that started. And since then, he's moved away for work purposes, so he's no longer part of our Trail Life group. But this summer, we were planning a trip to Gettysburg, and this is a little backstory to motivate the conversation we're about to have. And one of the things we wanted to do was do a tour of the Fort Indian Town Gap National Guard Base. And so one of the troop masters in our troop was contacting them and setting everything up, and everything seemed to be going smooth sailing for the most part. But then we got word back that we were going to be denied the opportunity to tour the base based on the fact that our Trail Life group is associated with a religious organization, a Christian religious organization. Well, Jeremy works with the PA Family Institute, which basically defends our religious liberties. So we got in touch with him because we knew that he knew a lot of what you can do in a situation like this where you're denied something based on religious grounds. And so he kind of took over the situation and really helped us out. And Jeremy, I'd like you to maybe fill in some more of the details about what all went on and how the whole situation got resolved.
Yeah, absolutely. So when the troop master originally reached out to the person on the base who's in charge of handling requests like this and to do tours. And this is something that they do. And not only do they do it, but their policies say that they do it for civic organizations and a bunch of other types of organizations. And so the troop master reached out and went through the proper processes, and everything was going fairly smoothly. The application process went in, and the purpose for the visits and the dates were all set. But eventually, they received word back that they were going to have to rescind that permission because they were a religious organization. And specifically, one of the things that they said was, we need to remain neutral. And so their definition of neutrality is not really my definition of neutrality, and I don't think it's the law's definition either, we need to treat religion as if it's something like asbestos. Like anywhere we see it, we need to get rid of it. We need to put up the plastic, don the hazmat suits, and get it out. That's not what the law is. That's not what religious freedom is. And so these public places need to treat religion neutrally. It's not necessarily giving special benefits. It's actually treating you worse. It's treating you hostile to tell you can't come on just because you're religious. And the irony of all of this is that during the course of the discussions, there were references made by the base personnel about how the Boy Scouts do these visits often and some of the things that they like to do. And so that was a part of the discussion, that a similar group that do very similar things and that exist for similar purposes were permitted to do these kind of things, while a group that has a little bit more Christian distinctives than the Boy Scout were not permitted to. So at the Pennsylvania Family Institute and the Independence Law Center, which is our law firm branch of the Pennsylvania Family Institute, we exist to protect religious liberty, to preserve life at all stages, and to promote marriage and the family. And so we do that in a couple of ways. We do that through our work in the courts, through educating people about what their rights are, through litigating cases, and also in the state legislature. So we go and we work with the elected leaders in the state house, the state senate, public school board members, people at town councils and county elected officials, and help them to craft good policy and do research for them on good policy, and advocate for good policy that protects marriage and the family, that protects life and preserves religious liberty. And so in this particular case, we were able to draft a letter to the base commander, worked with the solicitor, which is the JAG attorney for the base. And we were able to get this resolved because there are people that believed that you had to treat religion in a negative way. And sometimes that's because of hostility towards religion. Sometimes it's because of misunderstandings about what the role of religion in connection with government is. And this case, it was a little bit of a hybrid, but we were able to work that out. And so we didn't have to go to the step of litigating this case, thankfully. And most often than not, that's our preference, to try to do it in a peaceful way and in a way that protects people's religious liberty going forward. So we were really excited to be able to work with Patrick in the Trail Life group out at Keystone Christian Church.
Yeah, and we were really pleased with the letter that was drafted and how everything was resolved. The unfortunate ending was that by the time everything was back and we had permission granted to go, it was too late because we had already planned our trip out and everything. But I think it's still a win, obviously, because our religious liberties were upheld. And, I think
it pays dividends in the future.
Yeah, that's where I was trying to go.
Now the people who are coming after you, all the other trail lives around the state, and really trail lives around the country, because this became a national news story, are going to know what their rights are, and bases are going to correct any bases that are doing these sorts of improper procedures or discriminatory denials are going to be put on notice, and they're going to hopefully fix those in the future. And that's one of the things that's important, I think, especially as Christians. We sometimes think of defending a right in court or suing somebody. It has a very negative connotation to it. And as Christian lawyers, we don't want to be unnecessarily hostile. We really want to look for ways to serve our clients, but also to really create deep understanding in society and also for people on the other side. And so we always address these things with a spirit of trying to be cooperative, trying to be amicable. And because that, at the end of the day, I think you end up teaching more people, even the people on the other side initially. And we see that here, where bases across the country and also that particular base said, now we were going to go back and fix all of those policies to ensure that individuals don't make these kinds of wrong decisions in the future. And so it pays dividends in the future there. We've had a recent case with school districts, sort of similar. This past year, we had 3 different cases just in Pennsylvania. One of them was a public school district that wouldn't permit students in high school to hand out Bibles to their classmates. Unfortunately, that case did have to go to court, and we ended up winning that. We had other cases where there was a Valentine's Day party for a elementary school student who wanted to have a Valentine that they were going to pass out that said, "Roses are red, violets are blue. Somebody loves you. Here's a clue," and had John 3:16 at the bottom. And this is a little handmade heart-shaped card that this student had worked on. In their class Valentine's Day party, where all the kids hand out their little Valentines to their friends, the teacher saw that this student was handing this out and saw the John 3:16 on it, and so she confiscated them. She brought those to the principal's office, and the principal and the teacher called the parent and said, "They can't hand this out because there's a Bible verse on it. This is religious, and this is a public school." And again, they're treating it like it's asbestos. We found asbestos. We need to plastic off the other students and get this out of there. And so in that case, the parent found out about us through seeing a news article about one of the other cases that we were working on, and she called, and she didn't know that we did this work pro bono. We do this for free because of support from donors across the state that contribute to our work. But she just wanted to know, I don't want to get in fights. I really want to be a peacemaker. I really want, but I think that they're wrong. Can you help me on this? I don't have money to pay. And we said, well, we do this for free. And absolutely, we can help you. But that inclination of, I don't want to fight about it, I want to be loving, is very, very important. And it's something that people feel a little bit of a conflict over at times. But what ends up happening in that case is not only were able to get that resolved for her so that her son was able to pass out those cards and the religious freedoms of students were protected, but the solicitor for the school district represented over 10 other school districts and said now they're able to reach out to these other school districts who he had reached out to prior and said, "Hey, what would you do in this situation?" And they said, "Well, we wouldn't let them pass that out either." And now there's other school districts, the students in other school districts are going to be protected because this family decided to take a step out and have us write that letter for them and put the school on notice of what the Constitution really requires. And so not only does that help them in their student and being able to share their faith with others, but it also affected students in numerous other public schools across the state represented by that same attorney. And we even see that in the Bible where the Apostle Paul, he appeals to his status as a Roman citizen. He uses the avenues that are presented to him through lawful authority. And that's what we do as Christians whenever we utilize the court system and we utilize the legislature, just like everybody else in this country has a right to do, in order to make sure that we're moving towards truth and the freedom to be able to speak, and even the freedom to be able to speak things for other people, things that we disagree with. And so one of the issues with that Bible case, the Bible distribution case, a lot of people were saying, and actually we heard from the attorneys on the other side as a sort of threat. Well, if these students can hand out Bibles, then people of another religion are going to be able to hand out their books as well. Yeah. As if that was something that would make us shy away, and said, that's precisely what we want. We want that freedom, because that freedom that they have means that we're going to have the ability to share our faith as well. We don't want to live in a place where evangelism is forbidden.
Right.
And we're pretty confident that when the Christian faith is being shared, that truth wins. The fact that other people are allowed to share lies or things that we don't believe in is okay, because light drowns out the darkness.
Exactly.
So as Christians, we can be confident in that.
Yeah. That's pretty cool. I'm glad you brought up the example of Paul and how he used the law system of the land at that time. And that's a good example, because I think a lot of people aren't sure. Some Christians, well-intending, think they just have to be passive and turn the other cheek in all circumstances and situations. But biblically, it's permissible to stand up for the rights that we have in our country. And what are some misunderstandings that you see, or maybe why do you think there's this misunderstanding of the relationship between government and religion? I've heard this saying, it's freedom of religion, not freedom from religion, and that separation in the whole understanding of separation in church, separation of church and state. Why do you think there's such a gross misunderstanding?
Well, I think there's a few different reasons, and I think it's a hybrid. One of the reasons is certainly because there's a section of the population that wants to quiet truth. They want to prevent the sharing of the gospel, and it's a little bit of a spiritual element. And so that certainly exists, and we see that in our work. And I think if you turn on the TV for even a small amount of time, you'll see those kinds of things happening. And I think there's also a misunderstanding just because it's one of those issues that people are afraid to talk about. And when they do talk about it, it's very easy just to rely on inaccurate statements like separation of church and state. Well, what does that mean, and how does that get implemented? If it's being implemented and treating it as if it's asbestos, or like it's peanut butter in a classroom full of kids with peanut allergies, and we need to remove it anywhere we find it, then it's wrong. That's not how that phrase even came about. Now, that phrase, separation of church and state, doesn't exist anywhere in the Constitution, doesn't exist anywhere in the Declaration of Independence, doesn't exist in our laws. Where that came from is actually a letter from Thomas Jefferson when he was writing to the Danbury Baptists. And he was explaining to them how the government would not be infringing on church matters. So when he referred to the wall of separation, he was referring to a protection for churches so that the government wouldn't get involved in church matters and church business and ecclesiastical issues. At the same time, we had a country where Congress was printing Bibles and praying, calling the rest of them to pray. Thomas Jefferson, a deist, and some of them had sort of theistic, but maybe not what we would consider Christian views. Still, we're operating in a world where Christianity and Christian practices were intermixed with government practices. And that wasn't an establishment of religion to them. Remember, they were coming from a country that had established a religion where you had to be a certain religion. You had to be that religion in order to get benefits from the state. And that's not what we have here today, where people sort of look at this and say, well, separation of church and state means we need to completely keep all matters of religion aside. If people weren't being coerced into that religion or forced into that religion or being treated worse because they don't adhere to the religion of somebody who's in elected office, that is a good system to be in, where people can express their beliefs about things, whether they're in the government or not, but not be coerced into it. And so we certainly, as Christians, we wouldn't want the government to coerce us into another religion, although sometimes it certainly feels that way.
Yeah.
Whenever we're looking at the way that secular humanism is sort of imposed on everyone, or certain beliefs about human sexuality are imposed on everyone in the schools and in culture and through governments, and the raising of flags celebrating these other deeply held worldviews that are, at the end of the day, really no different than religion. So we can be upset when we're seeing these things, or somebody can say, well, I don't like the fact that they're praying this way, but that doesn't mean that there's an establishment of religion. But unfortunately, over time, our courts have come to impose a much stricter, and at the end of the day, harmful interpretation of that.
Yeah, I think it's hard for people in our country, myself included, to understand where our forefathers were coming from, where they lived in a country where there was a national religion that you had to be part of. And they were trying to come out of that and make it so that the citizens of this country were free to worship and be of any religion they wanted to. It's so hard for us to go back and be in that context and understand that. And I think that then leads us to misunderstand some of the things that were put in place to actually protect religion and protect Christianity. Just like this separation of church and state quote, taken out of context, it's actually been flipped around and said that, you know, the state can have nothing to do with religion whatsoever. And that's actually not what the intended purpose was of that statement there.
Yeah, absolutely. And you know, it's interesting that Pennsylvania started out as being a state that was absolutely dedicated to religious freedom. William Penn was very much harmed by what was going on in England at the time. And so when states like Virginia had Catholicism as their sort of their state religion, but Pennsylvania was founded on a foundation of religious freedom, the same way that our federal government was founded. But yet you look at our Pennsylvania Constitution, and we talk about how they make reference right in the preamble that we, the people of the Commonwealth of Pennsylvania, are grateful to Almighty God for the blessings of civil and religious liberty, and humbly invoke his guidance, do ordain and establish his Constitution. So the very state that I would argue was the most dedicated to making sure that we have religious freedom was not bashful right in the front of the Constitution, with also saying that we're grateful to Almighty God for the blessings of civil and religious liberty, and that we're humbly invoking his guidance. So it's fairly easy when you look back at the way that the nation was founded and the way that it was interpreted then, that they didn't want to coerce anybody into religion, and they wanted to leave openings so that people could practice their religions in the way they wanted and not be penalized for it. But that's quite different than the way that activists want to treat it today, where if you see any religious expression in government or by government actors, then your offense means that a religion has been established, and that's simply not the case. But that's the way that when courts start making the law instead of interpreting the law, that's where we come. So all that historical context, it's still important to know what are our rights now, what are our rights the way that courts would like to interpret them. And even there, we have a wrong interpretation of how things work, because, again, we believe that we just have to keep religion completely out of the public sphere, and especially students. Students are not the government. And so even if you're in a public school, it's important to know that students have and they retain their right to free speech and their right to religious exercise, even during the school day. And so that's what a lot of these cases come about, where teachers and administrators don't even understand that that's the law, and that there's certain times during the day, during non-disruptive times and non-disruptive manners, that students can express their religious belief to others, the same way that they could be talking about their beliefs about whether the Browns are better than the Steelers, right?
Yeah, that's really interesting. I'm curious, Jeremy, how did you, if you could take us back, how did you get involved with the PA Family Institute, and in particular, like, what's the motivation for you to get involved in all of these matters?
Well, I think when I was in high school, I remember going and working with my dad in the summer and listening to the radio, and I would listen to a program from Jay Sekulow and the American Center for Law and Justice, who used to do a lot of work like this. they're much more involved in international affair type issues today, but they used to do a lot of religious liberty type work. I think that's where I first heard about it. But when I went to college, I was on the debate team and really enjoyed that, and I really have a passion for religious liberty and for logic and wanting to explain sometimes difficult concepts in ways that people can understand. And so it was kind of a natural progression from there. There's great organizations out there nationwide. Alliance Defending Freedom is a wonderful religious liberty organization that I worked closely with and I'm an allied attorney with. And so did some training with them. The Pennsylvania Family Institute works closely with them on all of those types of issues, but focuses on Pennsylvania. And so we do this kind of work in Pennsylvania. So I've been doing this full time for about 4.5 years. Prior to that, I was at a law firm in Pittsburgh for about 10 years, doing civil litigation, general civil litigation and corporate matters and things of that nature, and got to do this kind of stuff on the side for pro bono work. But I'm been blessed and to be able to have donors for this organization that were able to add another employee, and so bring me on full time because we have more work than we can possibly handle. And so it's great to have a team of 3 attorneys today in Pennsylvania.
Wow, that's really cool. So the PA Family Institute pretty much works just within the borders of Pennsylvania. Is that correct?
Yeah. We pretty much focus on the state government, legislative things, and in local governments, county governments, townships, and school districts. But we're also focusing on the litigation aspect of things as well. So we'll work with cases that affect other states, and sometimes work on cases in other states whenever we're working as a team with other attorneys and some of the national groups like Alliance Defending Freedom. But we're sort of like the boots on the ground here in Pennsylvania.
Okay. Now, I know obviously everybody listening to this show doesn't live in Pennsylvania. So is there like a clearinghouse of resources of where people can go in their own state for like a New York Family Institute? Is there an Ohio Family Institute or a California Family Institute or something similar?
There are other state organizations like that. They all have, sometimes they have differences in their names, but we're all allied groups. Many of them might just do the legislative aspect and not the law firm side of things. We're one of the bigger organizations when it comes to these state policy institutes. But I would encourage people who are interested in the topic they could contact us at pafamily.org. And we have a lot of resources there, especially when you're talking about religious liberty issues that are really more of a national impact, and they don't differ too much from state to state. But groups like Alliance Defending Freedom and First Liberty down in Texas are 2 of the organizations that I would say are great to follow on social media, as well as us. We're at Pennsylvania Family Institute on Facebook and Instagram. But those 2 national groups, Alliance Defending Freedom and First Liberty, are wonderful national groups. And in fact, whenever we do cases, we'll often bring in one of them or other national groups just because working as a team, you get a lot more done and there's a lot more national impact. And so the case that we were talking about earlier with the Trail Life group, we called up First Liberty to be involved and to be our co-counsel in that case. So these are organizations that really work well together, that are paddling in the same direction, and aren't looking out for the interests of their individual organization above the greater good and the greater cause that we're all working towards.
That's great, man. Yeah, because I think it's important that people know there's resources out there whenever they feel like their religious liberties are being infringed upon in one way, shape, or form. Because it's very subtle. I mean, you have one school district out somewhere in Pennsylvania that is denying a kid the opportunity to pass out Valentine's Day cards because they have a Bible verse on them. And I'm sure little things like that happen all the time. And a lot of people don't know, that these types of organizations exist and that they can get help, and that some of it is pro bono work. And I think another another, and correct me if I'm wrong, another issue is that people aren't really exactly sure of what all religious freedoms they have, particularly when it comes maybe to the workplace or to school, or, you know, I don't know, civic organizations, or if
Right,
they're
right.
doing intramural sports, or
Hmm.
their community sports teams. Um, can you maybe speak to some of the common misconceptions that people have with respect to religious liberties, or maybe even expose how much liberty we actually do have?
Yeah, I mean, each situation is going to be a little bit different based on context. So, I mean, we can
Of course.
throw out a couple hypotheticals, but
Yeah.
let's take the workplace. And before we even go there, I would just point out that, you know, some of us who may homeschool our kids, or some of us who may have their kids in private school, these type of issues are still important for us to know, because the the kids that our kids come in contact with, or that maybe go to our church, certainly pastors are going to have people who do all sorts of schooling options. It's important for them to know so that they can help those kids there. But those the impressions of the proper place for religion and religious expression in society are formed at that young age. And so a lot of the misconceptions when it comes to the workplace, or in other areas, public areas, we sort of start developing those based on our beliefs at the time that we're in school. So we had one case where we did a presentation at a youth group about religious rights in school, and the young girl started to bring her Bible to school, because she didn't even know that she could bring her Bible to school. So she put her Bible in her book bag, and she took her notes from the discussion and had it in her Bible. The following year, her mother was opening her bag and helping her to find something, and saw the Bible in there, and she pulled it out. And this was a Christian woman who went to church, and said to her daughter, "I don't think you're allowed to have the Bible in school. I don't think you should be bringing this, because you might get in trouble." And she said, "No, Mom, I'm absolutely allowed to do this, because I did this event, and here's the notes about what my religious liberties are." And so the mom came to the church and thanked them so much for having an event like that. But that goes to show that we start getting these ideas of what we can and can't do early. So it's important to know that. But let's take a public workplace. There's times where talking about our religious beliefs, and just like talking about anything not related to work, is not going to be appropriate. But to the extent that you are in a job where you have time, or maybe let's say you're in the lunchroom or the break room, and people are talking about what they did on the weekend, and people are talking about their favorite team, or people are talking about politics, those are times where people can also talk about religion. If you're a math teacher, or if you're, let's say, a math tutor, there may not be times to be talking about those things, but it's about context. If you're working at the cash register and they don't want you talking about personal issues, or while you're interacting with the customer across the table, they don't want you commenting on their political T-shirt that they're wearing or something like that, or they don't want you doing those types of issues, then those can be, again, it's treat it similar, not worse than secular speech. So to the extent that people are allowed to talk about their secular issues, then it should be treated the same.
Cool. Good to know. Yeah, you mentioned, I never thought of it like that, how at a young age, kids are very impressionable. Well, we know that, but how their perception and understanding of religious liberties is being developed and impressioned at that time. And so if they are getting the impression that I'm not allowed to even bring a Bible to school, then they're going to have a hard time understanding that that's actually okay.
Mm-hmm.
And I think it works both ways. I think a lot of times things are subtly worked into different curriculums and things like that, to try to desensitize our children to things that are against the Bible and against Christianity and against God's righteousness. Because when they're young, they are so impressionable, and it's kind of easy to sway them one way or another. So I think it's all the more important that we know, as fathers and as parents and as teachers or pastors in a church or preachers or whatever, that we know what these freedoms are that we have, so that we can pass them on to the younger ones, and that we don't end up losing the religious freedom that we do have just because of ignorance. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah, absolutely, absolutely. That is of crucial importance. And even I think when you look at other issues nowadays, like you take things like folks who are identifying with the opposite sex and the fervor at which people are trying to indoctrinate kids on things dealing with those sorts of issues, stuff that you and I probably didn't have to deal with at the ages that kids today are dealing with them. And are being faced with those kind of things. And so as parents, one of the stories that I often refer to when I'm talking to parents about these kind of things is there's a Corrie ten Boom who wrote a book called The Hiding Place. She was instrumental in helping to protect and hide Jews during Nazi occupation. And one of the stories that she tells from her childhood is about a time that she was on a train with her dad, and he was a watchmaker, and so he was going to some sort of a convention or sales event or something where he had a suitcase filled with watch parts, and watch parts altogether are very heavy. And so she asked him a question about something dealing with sexuality when she was fairly young. And instead of answering her at the time, the father said, "Here, Corrie, can you carry the suitcase off the train for me?" And so Corrie tried and said, "Dad, I can't. It's too heavy." And he said, "Well, the same thing is true with some knowledge. I would be a bad father if I forced you to carry the suitcase off the train, and there are some things of knowledge that I have to carry for you now." And so what does that mean? Some people can listen to that story and say, well, we need to shield our children from everything as much as possible for as long as possible. But I would argue that when we think about that story and we say, at some point she's going to have to carry that suitcase off the train. And so a good father is going to have to prepare her, and through the natural course, she's going to become strong enough. He doesn't have to do anything out of the ordinary to ensure that she has enough strength to be able to carry a suitcase when she's an adult, right? So there's not much intentional effort on his part that he's going to have to do for that. But with our children today, they're going to have to carry very heavy things. They're going to have to deal with difficult to talk about topics where the world points fingers and says all sorts of things much earlier than we would have to do. And so our job as parents is not to expose them to everything as early as possible, because that would be a bad father, right? That would be forcing them to carry something that they can't. But we ought to be preparing them to be able to carry that, and we do that incrementally, and sometimes we have to do that earlier than we would like. So teaching somebody, if your nation is in a very bad war, you're going to have to teach your kids some survival type skills that you might not have to teach here in the United States in 2019. If we knew as fathers, and I have 4 sons and a daughter, and I know that you have some sons and daughters as well. Right. If we knew for a fact that our son, when they turn 17 or 18, we're going to be fighting in Fallujah, house-to-house combat, the way that we would be raising them right now, what would we be spending our time teaching them would be different than what we're probably teaching them right now. We would be teaching them things. We would be focused and intentional about teaching them things that we know they're going to come across. And as Christian parents, we know that there are things in the culture that they are trying overtime to impose on our kids. And so instead of just putting them in a bubble and hiding them, which is not the solution either, or on the other end of the spectrum, forcing it all on them before they're ready, we need to be saying, what are the ways that we can start preparing the foundations and start teaching them these things early? And so another thing that we do when we do a lot in this area, because this is really a huge clash in our culture at this time, but is helping pastors and parents understand how to talk about this issue, not only with their coworkers at work or politicians talking about it in the political sphere, but also parents and how to teach our children. And again, the different ages is going to warrant different types of conversations, but it's all building block. It's all building up to them knowing truth and being able to articulate that eventually. And so we need to remember that they're going to be carrying a heavy suitcase, and it's going to take intentional effort on our part because, quite frankly, as adults, all of us didn't have to do it. It feels sometimes like we're arguing the sky is blue. Well, of course it's blue. What more do we have to say? But there's good ways to do that, and we need to start preparing our kids both for understanding what religious liberty is, because today people hear religious liberty and then they translate it in their minds and say, religious liberty is just another word for bigotry. And there are judges who have that point of view, where if it's religious liberty for something that they agree with, okay. Or that religious liberty inside the four walls of your church, that's fine. But, actually expressing that or actually living out your faith, that's a bridge too far. And so that's something that we need to be able to instill in our kids from an early age.
Yeah, definitely. I remember on our Gettysburg trip, you and I were talking about having the talk with our kids, and we were having the conversation around this idea that it's not just a talk that you have with your kids. It's an ongoing dialogue. And I think that's where parents sometimes get themselves trapped into a corner when it comes to having these conversations about difficult topics. Is it's not a regular ongoing dialogue. It's this one-time conversation that you feel like you have to have about the birds and the bees or whatever it is. And then it's never brought up again. Whereas what we need to be doing as fathers is having ongoing dialogue, like you said, incrementally, and preparing and building those muscles as they get older. And then I think that opens a lot of doors, because now it's not a taboo subject in your home. And if something does come up at school and the kids are like, they were talking about this in the playground, or the kids brought this up at study hall, or I saw this on this kid's phone, and Dad, what is that? And that conversation, you can have that conversation. Whereas if it's a one-time thing and it's never brought up or talked about again, your child may not be comfortable approaching you about some of these sensitive and difficult subjects.
Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. I mean, it's an ongoing effort. We're teach them the gospel and the Bible on the highways and byways. And when they wake up, when they go to bed, and all throughout the day, we should be looking for those opportunities. But then applying the gospel to the culture that we live in is important. And so if we lived in a culture in whether it's Nazi Germany or in the 1840s in this country, certainly one of the pressing issues were, what is a human being and who is a human being? And no matter what time frame we're in, there's certain things that are going to require a little bit more effort on our part as Christian parents to instill in our children. And today we have other issues like that, with abortion and same-sex attraction and people identifying as opposite sex and things like that we didn't choose to be the cultural issue that we have to prepare our kids for. Just like the parents in 1840 maybe didn't choose to have the cultural issue that they had to deal with their children, racism and the innate value of every human life, regardless of the color of their skin. Or in Nazi Germany, the churches didn't choose to have to deal with the abuses and murder of Jewish people, but that was the situation that they found themselves in. And so as Christians, what's our response then? And so we have to be doing that, and we have to be doing it constantly, because it isn't a one-time conversation. It's building those foundations, because when we do that, then they're going to have confidence they're gonna be able to stand strong. And one of the things when we're talking with our trail life kids, and when you're sitting around the campfire, and you see those hot embers glowing, and you give them the analogy that as Christians, you hear the song, "This little light of mine, I'm going to let it shine, hide it under a bushel," and people are thinking about a candle. And what happens when the wind comes? We tell the kids, well, it's very easy to blow out a candle. A little bit of adversity comes and you blow out that candle and the light's gone. But when we have that continuing knowledge, when we have these continuing conversations, then what we're doing is we're creating a hot ember. And when we have those hot embers, what happens when the wind blows? The hot ember becomes hotter and it spreads and the flame comes. And so that's what happens when we prepare kids, and we do it continually, and we teach them and we give them firm foundations. We're not making a candle, we're making a hot ember. And so when the wind comes and the wind blows, then that knowledge that's instilled in them is going to spread. It's going to ignite.
Yeah.
And so that's sort of, I think, it's a good way of describing it to kids when you're sitting around a campfire, but I think it's a good way of describing it to parents too, about what you want to do. You don't just want to, flick the match and, okay, that's the one conversation, I lit the flame. Well, that's going to get blown out very easily.
Yeah.
But if you're taking the effort and the time to get a hot ember, well, that thing is going to be able to create another fire in the future.
Well said. I love that illustration there. I was just thinking of how if you really pay attention, you will have no shortage of opportunities to teach your children about these subjects, because you just drive down the street and you get object lessons, and you get billboards, and you get signs at stores, or the news is on or something like that. Even we were watching the movie Home Alone with our kids the other day, and I didn't realize it, but in the movie there's a couple parts where there's some language, and the kid that's left home alone is extremely rude and bratty to his parents.
Mm-hmm.
And there's an opportunity to talk with my kids about his behavior and how it's disrespectful and inappropriate. And while that's not necessarily on the topics that we're talking about today, that's just one example of how, just watching a seemingly innocent program can lead to an opportunity to have a spiritual discussion about these topics, and what's right and what's wrong, and embedding these things into our kids' minds.
Yes.
If you don't mind, Jeremy, I had one question before we wrap up, about what can a parent do? Let's say, the classic example is when it comes to health class, and there's this sex ed discussion, and a parent doesn't want their kid to participate in that, or there's a book that they have to read for English, and the parents feel like it's not appropriate for their age level, or it's not appropriate based on their religious convictions and beliefs. What's a proper process for a parent to go through if there's something in the school's curriculum that the kids are being asked to do or to complete as part of their requirement, but the parent feels it's not in accordance with what they want their children to be exposed to?
Mm-hmm. Well, so when there's lessons being taught, like let's say it's a human sexuality type of lecture, there are ways that you can get just request through the teacher or the administrator of the school to be exempt from that, and so the kid could go to the office and read a book or something like that. Now, the only flip side of that is you would still be responsible for taking any tests or quizzes. So if it's required as a part of the curriculum, as part of that, but oftentimes those sorts of things aren't, or they are something that is a separate and apart from curriculum. So it's something that's just a speaker who comes in, and there are some who are good. There are some who are not, and sometimes it's hard to know which is which. And so depending on the age of the kid, high school students, I do encourage them to talk with their parents about the stuff that they're hearing, because that sometimes is how information can get back to others to know, hey, you know what, that crossed the line. The stuff that they were doing crossed the line, or maybe it was something that they had a guy like you in there talking about risk avoidance, and it ended up being a good one. And so sometimes it's hard to know ahead of time. But having those communications with your child is important. But so you can request accommodations. So if there's a book that somebody's reading, sometimes people have requested to read an alternate book and to do the same sort of responses when it comes to writing assignments and things like that. But there are some times that could work, and then there are other times where it might not. But if there's something that's truly egregious, and sometimes there are, then talking to the administrator, the teacher, or the school board about getting a book that's better, because there are a lot of books out there.
Yeah.
And some are more valuable and better than others. And so if we're picking bottom of the barrel things just for the sake of controversy, which it seems at times, then, you know, what's the point? So there are times where that can be very effective too. But, you know, that's a case by case type of thing. A lot of these are case by case scenarios, and so the response sort of depends on the specifics. But getting reasonable accommodations wherever possible is good. And then there are other times where, depending on the maturity, the spiritual maturity as well of your child, then being there to hear what the other side is saying on things, so that they can then be somebody who can say, you know, I'm going to go back and talk to my parents about this. I'm going to go back and look up stuff about this with my parents, and we're going to figure out a way to be able to respond, both to maybe people in my class, or maybe to the teacher, or maybe the next day's lecture. And so I've heard of a lot of instances of kids in biology class where they're talking about evolution, do just those sorts of things, because the teacher is handcuffed in some ways on what they can and can't say. There's a lot more they can say than I think some of them know that they can, but students aren't. Students have the ability to discuss and bring up questions, and to bring up problematic issues with what's being taught. And so sometimes it's, depending on the student, it's a good idea to stay there, learn what the other side is talking about, so that you can be prepared for an answer for those who ask.
Awesome.
And we know in 1 Peter, we need to be prepared to have an answer for those who ask about the hope we have in Jesus. And I think that we can be prepared to have an answer for those who ask about things like evolution as well.
Yeah, I think that definitely applies from that verse. Well, Jeremy, thank you so much for coming on the show today. I really appreciate it. If somebody wants to get in touch with you or with the PA Family Institute, I know you threw a couple websites out earlier, but what's the best way to reach out and connect?
Yeah, if you go to pafamily.org, there's a giant box where you can sign up to get our emails there. So it's important to find out what's going on in our state. Whenever there's legislation that the state government is looking to pass, it's very important to be able to send an email or do a phone call to your state representative or your state senator, and we make a very easy method for you to do that. Sometimes we'll even write the email for you, give you the information for who your state representative senator is, because it's important that they hear from you. So we'll keep you updated on anytime stuff like that's happening, so that you can just spend 30 seconds in giving them that call, because when those representatives or senators get 4 or 5 calls talking about one issue, it becomes an issue for them. Their flag goes up and they start paying attention. So it's important that we engage them. It's important that we pray for them. And so we can give you opportunities to do things like that for them as well, and find out what's going on around the state. You can also follow us on Instagram at Pennsylvania Family Institute, or PA Family Council, or PA Family Institute, and on Facebook as well. So those are great places to see current events and stay abreast, so that you can have more of those opportunities with kids. And what would you do if you had this Valentine's Day card, or what would you do if you had this? We even had one with a Halloween candy, and so they provide some good jumping off points for having those discussions with your kids.
Awesome, man. I'll be sure to link that up in the show notes. One final question before we wrap it up is, in your opinion, Jeremy, what makes a great dad? I know it's kind of shifting gears a little bit, but I always like to get the input from all my guests.
Sure. Well, I think a great dad is somebody who is seeking to glorify God in everything that they do. And so if if that's your first priority, if your first priority is glorifying God in the way that you're raising your children, I think that's a necessary first step. And we need wisdom. And so fearing the Lord is the foundation of all wisdom. And so we need people who are seeking to glorify God in everything they do and say, and dads who fear the Lord. And so when you do those two things, I think we're going to be a lot more intentional about the way that we're raising our children, and that we're not going to trade off good things, or we're not going to trade off great things for good things, which I think often as fathers we can have a temptation to do it. So that's another conversation for another day. But
yeah. No, I totally understand it. You got to fight mediocrity at every turn.
Yeah.
Well, Jeremy, like I said, thank you so much for coming on the show today. I really appreciate it, and I know the guys are going to appreciate it that listen in. You've shared some very valuable information that I think a lot of people are definitely going to benefit from. Just knowing that there are services out there available to help protect and defend religious liberties helps to put it. I think it helps to put more of a backbone in us as Christians to know that there is help available, there is support, there is encouragement. I see it also as part of that iron sharpens iron mentality. So, like I said, thanks for coming on the show. I appreciate it.
Absolutely. Thank you.
All right, man. Take care. All right, gentlemen, there's our show with Jeremy Samek. Thanks for tuning in today. I hope our conversation was a blessing to you and that you leave this episode with a sense of confidence in your rights as a Christian, with more of a backbone of your rights in your religious liberties. I wanted to quickly remind you before we go that we're still working toward greatly increasing our reviews on iTunes. Reviews, like I've said, boost the show's ratings, which in turn means that more men will get to hear these life-changing interviews. So if you could hop on over to iTunes and leave a quick written review, all I need is a sentence or two, and that would be much appreciated. Now, if you take a screenshot of your review and message it to me either on Facebook or Instagram with that screenshot, and then add your physical address, I'll send you a free Dad Hackers window decal as a thank you. Then head on over to the show notes at dadhackers.us/069. While you're there on the page, you'll find links for how to connect with Jeremy and what he's doing, as well as opportunities to connect more with the Dad Hackers community, as well as our Iron Men Mastermind. All right, gentlemen, until next time, remember Proverbs 27:17, as iron sharpens iron, so one man sharpens another.